Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I think you're all negotiating Arab-Israeli peace here, so I don't want to interrupt you. You probably will have more success than we have had. I want to greet you all to the Baker Institute this evening and to address an issue that has been on our docket at the Baker Institute since our inception. In our Center for the Middle East, we've been dealing with conflict resolution in the Middle East, and especially in the earlier days, Israel and Syria, Israel and Palestine, Israel and Lebanon. And we decided, we published two very important reports in 2010, which became a document for American negotiators on the territorial aspects of an Israeli-Palestinian agreement. And then in 2013, we did an executive summary report for decision makers in Washington on what the parameters of an Israeli-Palestinian peace should be. So these many years later, we decided in coordination with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington that perhaps the time had come to address the Israeli-Palestinian issue again, but in a very objective, factual manner, realizing that the prospects for Israeli-Palestinian peace are very, very dim today. You have to be realistic about this, but given the fact that the Trump administration has truly bandied quite publicly the ultimate deal that the president wants to make, between the Israelis and the Palestinians, that and then all the hype and speculation about the American plan, whatever it may be, because it's never been made public in any sense, that the time had come for two serious think tanks with credibility to just one think tank to analyze, here's what the two-state solution is, and here's what a one-state solution would be in its various forms. But of course, there's a third option, which we're living today, which is the continuation of the very dangerous status quo. So we thought this would be good without any illusions that anyone in Washington would listen to us, but we are disseminating the findings of this report to all levels of the government and decision makers and think tanks. And I think it will serve a very useful purpose, because when you have so much speculation outside of any factual context, it's good to have a report like this that says, well, here are the facts on each option. So that's what we've done. Let me briefly, this report will be available on our website in a PDF form very shortly, and so you just go to the Baker Institute website, bakerinstitute.org, and just take a look at it in the next few days, and it'll be up on the website, and you could read the full report. So the Baker Institute took on the two-state solution, and the Carnegie Endowment took on the one-state solution. This was co-authored between Marwan Muasher and the Carnegie Endowment. He's a former minister Foreign Affairs in Jordan, ambassador, very serious scholar and expert involved in negotiations, and I took on the authorship of the report. On our side, we had two Palestinian experts, one Khalil Shikaki, who is probably the best statistician and poll taker in Palestine, to really get a polling of the people and the sentiments of the people on the Palestinian side. And Sami Abed, who is Abu Mazen or Mohammed Abbas, the president of Palestine, the top expert on the territorial issue. On the Carnegie Endowment side, they had an equal number of Palestinian and Arab and Israeli expertise. So let me just give you a broad, what my intent this evening is to just give you a broad outline of the reports, and then I think we'll open it up to discussion. I'm sure you all have a lot of questions and on this issue. So since the Madrid Peace Conference in 1991 brought the Israelis and the Palestinians together for the first ever face-to-face direct negotiations between Israel and all of its immediate Arab neighbors. That was the great success of Madrid. And the parties were very reluctant to come to the table, but under Bush 41 and Secretary Baker, we made a major effort with the international community, and we got the parties to the table, which is a story in itself, but I'll go into. But ever since that time, an international consensus emerged that the eventual solution would involve the creation of a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, existing in peace and security next to the state of Israel. This is the so-called two-state solution. The actual borders of the two states, the fate of Israeli settlements in the West Bank, and how the city of Jerusalem would be shared, and how the refugee issue would be resolved, were debated in many different fora. While the two sides, as you know, came close several times to agreeing on the substance of these parameters, no deal was ever reached. The goal of a two-state solution is under very serious challenge today because the situation of peace negotiations is simply stagnated. The number of settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem has exceeded 650,000, putting in major doubt the prospects of a geographically contiguous Palestinian state. U.S. diplomatic efforts under Donald Trump's administration appear to be aimed at redefining key issues such as Jerusalem, refugees in Gaza, in ways that certainly alienate Palestinians as well as European allies. In Israel, the passage of a new nation-state law threatens the treatment of Arab and other citizens of Israel as second class, a move that many believe effectively legislates discrimination. At the same time, divisions on the Palestinian side between the West Bank and Gaza, along with Palestinian factional political disputes, have done very little to advance the Palestinian national project. The Palestinian leadership is in disarray today. As a result, Palestinian leaders are obliged to find solutions to such disputes in order to make progress in their cause. It's a big question. Moreover, there are clear signs of a growing perception among Palestinians and Israelis that a two-state solution that meets the minimum needs of both communities might be impossible to attain. So 25 years of diplomacy, including the Oslo Accords, the Camp David Summit, the Clinton Parameters, the Taba Summit, the Arab Peace Initiative, the Middle East Roadmap, the Olmert-Abbas talks within the Annapolis process, John Kerry's peace efforts and others have done little to stop the negatively shifting status quo. And I say the status quo is negatively shifting. Yet, and I'll explain that. Let me explain that up front. I think Israel can live with the status quo because of its military might and its economic might. But it's a very dangerous status quo because, as we've seen, wars break out. There are rockets into southern Israel. Recent briefings that I've attended in Israel by military intelligence and other national security experts, there's a very deep preoccupation in the Israeli national security establishment over the danger of a possible new war on Israel's northern border with Lebanon involving Hezbollah. Now, neither Israel nor Hezbollah want to go to war now. But let me tell you, having lived in the Middle East for all these years and dealt with these issues, logic doesn't travel in the Middle East. So we, as Westerners, can very nicely say, well, both sides don't want war and all that. But bad things happen in a vacuum. Bad things happen in a stalemate. And escalation is very, very probable. And the bad news on the, especially, and I'm focusing more on the northern border in Hezbollah, is that Hezbollah has gotten a lot of on-the-job training in Syria, fighting for Assad's regime. Their troops are being seasoned. They've increased their missile capabilities, not only in numbers, but in range. So this time, if there is a war, Hezbollah rockets can reach deep into Israeli territory, not just in the north of Israel. So, and those are just two factors. I'm not talking about the disarray in Syria now and the Iranian presence in Syria. So the situation around Israel is very troubling and in a great deal of disorder. The Palestinians are not achieving self-determination in any context, and their situation is deteriorating. It's not a pretty picture, but it's the option we are living in today. This is the troubled, if I can call it the troubled status quo. So simply, the Israeli-Palestinian issue is not going away. Rather, demographic trends in settlement construction mean that the two communities, ironically, are growing ever closer physically, but miles apart politically, socially, culturally, and economically. So our report, our joint report, attempts to look at the actualities and the trends with a fresh and analytic eye. Our analysis of the situation is the same, but of course, what we're drawing is the conclusions of the two options and what they look like. A key question, I think, now for policymakers is, do we need new ideas or new determination and political will behind previous ones? In other words, is it just a question of leadership on the Arab side, on the Israeli side? Bibi Netanyahu has been probably one of the most successful, if not the most successful, politician in Israeli history. He's been re-elected time and time again, but he is a prime minister of a very narrow coalition that really, even if he wanted to go forward, which is debated amongst Israelis. You know, if you live in Israel like I did when I was ambassador to Israel, it makes our oral democracy look like a kindergarten. They debate these issues with more openness and frankness than we do here. So he is constrained under the parameters of his narrow and very right-wing coalition on how far he will go. Mohammed Abbas, who I believe is a valid interlocutor for peace, his whole history, unlike Arafat's, has been he put the stakes on making a deal with Israel. And it's failed. Every single time it's failed. So his credibility is at an all-time low. And the Palestinian leadership is very weak, and especially with the division with Hamas. So again, I pose that question to you: do we need new ideas or new determination and political will behind previous ones? But our two reports also highlight an important political reality. Any solution must adequately address the needs of both sides, or it's not going to work. And let me say here, which gets into the very debate on these issues, as I'm sure those of you who follow these issues, political compromise is not a dirty word. Political capitulation of your principles is. It's a very important distinction in diplomacy. Political compromise is the art of politics, the art of diplomacy. But don't expect your interlocutor to capitulate on principles. And if negotiators go into it with that in mind, the chances for success of a negotiation are enhanced. And we've done it in the past. And Jimmy Carter did it at Camp David. We did it in Madrid. The Israelis and the Jordanians did it directly and concluded a peace agreement in 1994. So there are aspects of success when this principle is adhered to. And the other thing is that a peace settlement cannot be imposed on either side. This business of imposing a settlement on either the Israelis or the Palestinians in this case is you cannot impose. We were talking just a little earlier outside in the lobby that the art of diplomacy, again, is creating the diplomatic landscape where it becomes very difficult for the two sides that you're dealing with to say no. That's That's the art of diplomacy. And that's exactly what we did in the build-up to Madrid, especially when I was ambassador to Syria, to get the Syrian president at the time, Hafez al-Assad, to say yes to direct negotiations with Israel. His whole career was based on avoiding that and going to the UN, which the Israelis had no credence in. So the ability for any future administration, either here or the leaders in the area, the parties, is to create the political landscape where it's very difficult for the parties to say no to. Frankly, I don't think strategically anyone is thinking in these terms. Our part of the report does not deny that a one-state reality is emerging, and I'll discuss that very briefly, and that the two-state solution is in trouble. But what we argue in our report is that the two-state solution should not be abandoned, as it provides the most coherent framework for a democratic Israeli state living in peace and security next to an independent and sovereign Palestinian state. The Carnegie Endowment section recognizes that a one-state solution is emerging, whether desirable or not, and calls for scrutinizing solutions that take this reality into account instead of just wishing it away. So that is the general concept of the report. Again, I recommend that you all who are interested in this read this, because I think it is edifying and I believe it's objective. So, under President Trump's administration, his methodology, as we've seen both on domestic and foreign policy, is disruptive politics. You shake up the system. You shake up what he calls the stale political consensus of the past. You break things up. It's very transactional. We see that on trade issues. We see that on all the issues he deals with, basically, NAFTA, and again, on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. Recognizes Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, cutting aid to the Palestinian refugees very drastically, moving the embassy to Jerusalem, shaking up the system, departing from what previous administrations have done. So they have clearly devoted attention to the ultimate deal between the Israelis and the Palestinians, but as of today have been keeping very closely held whatever they're going to come up with. And it's been delayed and delayed and delayed. We thought it would come out in September, but it looks like it'll come out, if at all, after the November elections. So let me make one key point here. Whatever the administration in office, if the negotiating approach for peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians is not based on the fundamental principle enshrined in 2 UN Security Council resolutions after the '67 war, 242, 338, the principle of land for peace. It's about land and peace. All this talk about economic peace is a partial truth. Obviously, what that means is let's build up the Palestinian economy, let's give people jobs, let's build ties, let's branch out to the Arab world, let's circumvent the real issue of land for peace, which means drawing borders, making the tough compromises on the territorial divisions that will have to be made in any agreement, how we deal with the settlements. The territorial aspects of peace are critical. So land for peace has to be the fundamental principle for any viable solution, or else there won't be one. There simply won't be one. Concentrating only on economic measures, concentrating only on security measures, relations with the greater Arab world are all good, but they will not lead to an agreement. So that's really important. The other thing is that we as the United States, in this report I deliberately did not use the word honest broker. We have been known as the honest broker between the Arabs and the Israelis. I think we've lost our reputation on that. But what I use in the report, that the United States has to regain the position of being a trusted broker between the two sides. Okay? Or else we won't be able to play that role that we traditionally have played. So for the Palestinians, the years of Israeli, I mentioned Bibi's position, political position, and there's a big debate in Israel whether Bibi Netanyahu is really interested in a two-state solution, or if he did have a political coalition that was wider than the one he has now, that he might move forward on that. That debate I have no answer on, but that's sort of out there. But for the Palestinians, the years of Israeli occupation have taken a toll, and realizing an independent state means that difficult choices have to be made by them. Today, the divide between the West Bank and Gaza, the fractured nature of Palestinian politics, the ineffectiveness in some areas of governance, the unconstructive rhetoric and intransigence do little to help the Palestinian national project. This is part of our report. So there's a need for reconciliation among the Palestinian factions. On both sides of leadership today and in the future would be served by clarifying the visions for peace, being pragmatic, and seeking common ground while being prepared to make difficult decisions required for the long-term well-being of their respective peoples. And again, I will repeat, the critical distinction between political compromise and compromising on principles is very much there. So what are the general parameters of a two-state solution? It's been there for years. I'm not going to go through all of it. We don't have enough time, but there has to be an international framework. Again, I said 242338, the UN Security Council resolutions, the principle of land for peace. And territory and settlements have to be, we have to delineate the borders basically along the lines of the 1967 borders. And this is the line of the 67 borders, and various adjustments, we'll get into this a little later, will have to be made. But you have nothing to negotiate if you don't really define what you're negotiating about in terms of territory. Refugees, a comprehensive resolution of the Palestinian refugee problem must be negotiated. Jerusalem as the capital of both states, based on the 67 borders. Security, basically with the withdrawal of Israeli forces from Palestinian territory and ending the occupation, a non-militarized Palestinian state should be created with special security arrangements and the possibility of a deployment of a multinational force in the Jordan Valley. Mohammed Abbas has said basically publicly that he could live with a demilitarized state because he'd rather spend the money not on a military force but on economic revival of the Palestinian economy. And there are other parameters that we won't go into, but Sami Al-Abid, our Palestinian expert on the territorial issue, and this is a Palestinian analysis in his view, agreed modification of the border between Israel and Palestine could allow approximately 80% of Israeli settlers to stay where they are, 80%, where they are living today. On the Palestinian side, the definition of a permanent border is critical to state building. It creates the certainty necessary to successfully manage refugee resettlement in the new state of Palestine and economic state building measures, and allows the Palestinian government to plan and construct an effective physical infrastructure to build a prosperous Palestinian state. Palestinians advocate for a settlement freeze during negotiations as a confidence building measure. And you know how sensitive that issue is on the Israeli side. Now, what you see here is based on one of our earlier reports, but still valid today. In any settlement, what we came up with, this was an Israeli team and a Palestinian team. This had input from both sides, so this is not just a figment of our imagination. But here's the armistice lines of 67, or the 1967 borders, okay? So here are some of the major Israeli settlements. You can see Ariel really goes into the heart of the West Bank. This is the West Bank. This is Israel. This is Gaza. You can't see over here. So you see, especially around Jerusalem, and very deliberately, are massive settlement blocks. Especially those of you who have been to Israel, Ma'ale Adumim, and others, and the south around Bethlehem. But this over here, sort of the north of Israel, Ariel goes right into the heart of the West Bank, and settlements have just accrued. Now, what some of the negotiations that have taken place have come to is that this border would be redrawn, basically along the 67 lines, that would incorporate some of these massive settlements that would become part of the Israeli state. But that compensation, one by one territorial, would be given to Palestine, the state of Palestine in the north, and in these areas here. And they would have to be industrially developed, but it would be a one-on-one territorial exchange. A lot of this has been already on the negotiating table. I mean, this is not new. These discussions have taken place. And it's basically, as I said, a one-on-one territorial exchange. So this is very problematic. The Palestinians are very much against having Israeli settlements so much into the West Bank. But again, the point that we made in our analysis, and this is coming from a Palestinian expert, that 80% of these settlements could be incorporated into an Israeli state. So that's an important factor. So it's not as mission impossible as some people speculate. This shows you here, the legend is, again, these are the territorial compromises that would be made for the Palestinians, but these show you the Palestinian areas that are populated in the West Bank. This is Jerusalem, and of course the Holy Quarter, the Christian, Jewish, Muslim, and the Armenian Quarter. Being Armenian, I want you to know there is an Armenian Quarter, which is one of the most ancient religious sites of the Armenian religious community. Armenians are great real estate brokers. The Armenian Quarter sits on top of Mount Zion, which always, when I was ambassador to Israel, gave me an eerie feeling because I always thought the government would want to negotiate that away from me. But there it is. Now here is what makes Jerusalem so critical is just look at the Christian Quarter, the Temple Mount, the Western Wall, the Haram al-Sharif, the Dome of the Rock for the Muslims, the Jewish Quarter. This is the most sensitive of all the issues. But there are the basic things during the Clinton administration, I think you've heard, is that one of the solutions is that Western Jerusalem, which is predominantly Jewish, and then Eastern Jerusalem, which is predominantly Arab, but being continually settled by Israelis now, that they would become the respective capitals of both states, and the municipal arrangements would be made that Jerusalem would be the capital of both states, and this would be under a special regime to allow total freedom of access to all practitioners of religion into the Holy Basin. So this gives you another, it's a close-up of Ma'ale Adumim, You can see this is Jerusalem, and you can see how these settlement blocks, Ramot, Pisatzev, and these others have been built around Jerusalem. I'll leave that up. Okay, so while political trends on both sides seem discouraging, and here's an important aspect of our report that I'd like to leave this with you, is public opinion on both sides remains dynamic. It's not set in stone. And one of the most interesting parts of these reports, on both our report and the Carnegie report, is that when you take soundings of Palestinians and Israelis and you actually add incentives to the polling question, and I'll get into that in a little while, public opinion changes rather dramatically. And where this report can be very useful for policymakers is by, public opinion isn't going to be the only factor driving the decisions of political leaders on either side. But when you take these attitudes into consideration, and this is, again, very valuable information, you can see that policies and a negotiating approach can be elaborated, which would really aid in negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians. So, with no illusions, public opinion trends in Israel are not highly favorable for a two-state solution. But here is an important factor. Although no alternative vision is more favored in Israel. They're not favorable to it, but when they look into the alternatives, no alternative vision is more favored when you do into the percentiles than the two-state solution. That's important. When presented with various proposals aimed at ending the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the two-state solution, a confederation between the West Bank and Jordan, a confederation between the West Bank, Palestine, and Israel, whatever confederation, or confederation between Israel, the West Bank, and Jordan, or a single binational and democratic state, 46% of the Israeli Jewish public, remember, Israel's Arab population is 20% of Israel's population, are Arab. They're Israeli citizens, 20%. But 46% of the Israeli Jewish public still support the two-state solution. So it's not dead, but it's in the emergency room. An overview of the entire political spectrum shows that the two-state solution is the option with the highest support among all groups, including those that can define themselves as being moderately to the right. You read the report, we just simply don't have the time, but let me talk about some of these incentives. Now, this is an Israeli analysis, which I'm giving you now. It's not this is the Israeli analysis in our report. Despite the majority's rejection of an Israeli-Palestinian agreement and Palestinian state, its opposition can be shifted significantly once specifically defined incentivizing policies are added. And these are serious polling taken in Israel by the respected INSS, the Institute for National Security Studies in Israel. We had their director here, Yadlin. Security remains central to Israeli public opinion in all polling. For example, if there is a multilateral force established, Israeli public opinion begins to support in higher numbers the two-state solution. If the agreement allows Jews to visit the Temple Mount, 47% of Israeli Jews said they would support it. 40% of Israeli Jews said they would support the agreement if it's defined the Palestinian state as having a democratic political system. Israelis showed increased support for the plan that included mutual recognition that Palestine and Israel are the homeland of their respective peoples. An additional incentive that appeals to both sides is putting any future Trump plan within the framework of the 2002 Arab Peace Initiative, which means that if Israel makes peace with Palestine, its Arab neighbors, of course Syria is off the table now, that the Arab countries and behind them the Muslim world would recognize Israel. That's a huge incentive. So on the Palestinian side, in polling, and it's fascinating how these polling parallels. The majority of Palestinians polled reject the two-state solution. One key finding on the Palestinian surveys is while a public is not a force for peace, it is not an impediment to peace. If leaders do reach a peace agreement with various incentives, polling suggests that the public is likely to support the agreement. So, for example, based on public opinion research among Palestinians, particularly during the past 3 years, findings point to one conclusion. Palestinian public opinion, as I said, is not an impediment to peace. The key issues for the Palestinians are Jerusalem, the refugees' right of return, and the attributes of state sovereignty. With the right incentives, Palestinian public opinion can be persuaded to support peacemaking based on the painful compromise involved in the two-state solution. So the Palestinians have not, in the polling, yet declared the two-state solution dead, regardless of the harsh realities on the ground today. For example, incentives such as successful state and institution building a democracy, fighting corruption on the Palestinian side, that would boost the prospects for public support. Unfortunately, the only interaction most Palestinians have with the Israelis now is one imposed by occupation policies, security measures, and efforts have been made for more people-to-people contact between Israelis and Palestinians, especially youth. That's why I was particularly unhappy to see the Trump administration do a minor $10 million cut-off aid of a program that fosters Israeli youth and Palestinian youth to meet. I mean, come on. Now, one very important thing in the polling that's reflected on both sides, Israeli and Palestinian, an increasing number, they're not the majority now, but an increasing number of Palestinian youth are coming to the conclusion that the one-state solution is the way to go because of the failure of all these efforts and the continuing occupation, the continuing lack of any hope for statehood. And they are concluding, this is a young generation, this is what's coming up. Why in God's name do we want to create another corrupt, autocratic Arab state like all the other Arab states? Why don't we become part of the Israeli state in a one-state solution, enjoy equal rights as Palestinian citizens with Israelis, and reach our destiny accordingly? Now, this is easier than it seems, but as it sounds rather. But this is a very important finding. This is a very important finding because this is breaking past models. Now, the problem with that is that when you look into a one-state solution, and I will just briefly summarize the Carnegie report on that. What does that mean? Because you have a one-state, and then you have a binational state, and you have what it can be called a shared sovereignty. So Marwan Muashir, my co-author, states that one-state proposals have been considered taboo in American policy circles for a long time. And there's the danger to Israel remaining a democratic Jewish state in a one-state solution is, as the Carnegie report states, the main difference between our analysis of a two-state solution and the Carnegie reports is we looked at the situation, as I presented to you, from the diplomatic angle, while the Carnegie looked at it from a demographic angle. So if there is a one-state solution in either form, the demographic growth rates of the Palestinians are higher than that of the Israelis, except for the ultra-Orthodox Jews. And over time, if there is a one-state solution, there'll simply be more Palestinians in that state than Jews. What does that say for what, especially Bibi Netanyahu, has said the goal is a democratic Jewish state? So that's a big strategic factor in the equation of a one-state solution, no matter what form. But there are three primary models that the Carnegie report has. One person, one vote. The state would be a state for its citizens with individual rights, but does not provide special collective rights to Jewish or Arab communities. Second model is binational or federal, provides for both individual and collective rights. Groups would share land, but remain nationally separate. And then there's this vague concept of shared sovereignty, a cohabitation model that Yossi Beilin, a former labor leader in Israel, where Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs can both claim the entire land. Resources would have to be adequately shared. Palestinian institutions, especially the Palestinian Authority, must have more legitimacy and strength. But you can see Jimmy Carter talked about the one-state solution as being an apartheid state in Israel. He got a lot of criticism for using the word apartheid. But the fact remains is that, is it possible, and this is the question for a one-state solution, for there to be really a one person, one vote and equal citizens' rights, or will the Palestinians be treated as second-class citizens? And that's where the South African model comes into play. It's a legitimate question. I personally feel that, from what I know of Israeli thinking and history, and having lived and worked there, that a one-state solution would go against the whole concept of a democratic Jewish state. So while people are bandying about this idea, you've got to be realistic. The only real option that exists right now, as I said, is the continuation of this very dangerous status quo. The political leadership on either side is not ready to make the hard compromises for a settlement, either two-state or a one-state solution. But this issue is not going to go away. Another thing you've all heard is that the Palestinian issue is no longer as relevant and central as it has been in the past, because the great threat now is Iran and chaos in Syria, ISIS, terrorism, and that the Palestinian issue is simply not as central as it has been before. There's some truth to that. But to make that a basic thesis is fallacious, because the Palestinian issue is not going to go away. They're there. It's going to have to be dealt with. It's not going to disappear. So, and also these efforts at maybe circumventing the land for peace, the hard, tough land for peace negotiations that have to take place, that you can sort of sidestep this by Israel reaching out to Saudi Arabia, to the United Arab Emirates, to Qatar and other Arab states, and Egypt, and then, you know, maybe having them pressure the Palestinians to make compromises that Israel wants. Well, I did a sounding in a recent trip, well, it's a year-old trip to the Gulf, and what I heard in private from the leaders of those states is that they would not go along with that. Although the trope is that this is a real option. So, looking ahead, let me just end with the role of the United States. I think whether, God knows what the Trump administration is going to come out with. And maybe he doesn't know. And he probably doesn't know. But the thing is that, again, we have to become a trusted broker. I would hope that our negotiators will read at least the results of these public opinion surveys and how they can be an indication of how negotiations could go to get confidence on both sides. Because when I was involved in these negotiations for many years, be it with the Syrians and the Israelis, the Palestinians, the Jordanians, when we, the negotiators, were out there making progress at times, and public opinion was back here. When the crunch time came, when we said, hey, we're close to something, but then the political leaders on both sides got cold feet, because when they looked at their political constituencies, they saw they weren't with them. So what's very important in diplomacy is that your actual track one negotiations should be seconded by a parallel public diplomacy effort to bring the public opinion together along the lines I indicated. These are some of the lessons, or not lessons, but the suggestions we're making to our government. First, I think we should define a very general political horizon, not what the actual deal will look like, but a general political horizon, because, you know, if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. So there should be a general idea on territorial issues, on refugees, on Jerusalem, on security arrangements, general parameters that you can get the buy-in from both sides. And America can play a big role in defining that. And there have been many parameters that have been out there. The other thing is that the negotiations should be top-down in terms of putting out parameters, the big issues, but also bottom-up. Yes, build economic development and resources, build security arrangements, build regional contacts, infrastructure, but it should be both a top-down and bottom-up approach. They're not mutually exclusive. What we did in the prelude to the Madrid Peace Conference, which I thought became very effective, is that President Bush 41 and Secretary Baker drafted letters of assurance to each one of the parties that were confidential. And so to Hafez al-Assad on Syria, he said, here is our commitment to Syria if you go into direct negotiations with Israel. To Shamir in Israel, here's our commitments to Israel. To the Jordanians, to the Lebanese, to the Palestinians, we did the same thing. We orally briefed each party on the content of those letters, but we never gave the other sides the full letter. We weren't playing games, but we thought that the confidential of these assurances, it gave much more confidence that this was a personal letter from the President of the United States and Secretary of State to them. These letters of assurance were critical in getting the parties to agree to go to Madrid. These are diplomatic instruments that can be used. So let me end by saying the continuation of the status quo is the current option in play. But in the short and long term, it's a formula for instability and intermittent conflict for Israelis and Palestinians. And don't forget what I said about Hezbollah and Lebanon. While the Palestinian issue may to some not be perceived as central as it has been in past decades, it's not going to disappear. And the interests of all regional and international parties, a negotiated settlement should be a priority. Thank you. I am now ready to suffer your questions. You're close.
There's an enormous new reality in the Middle East, which is Iran, Russia, Turkey. How does all this play into the desire everybody seems to have for a two-state a solution to the Palestinian conflict? And we have these major power nodes dividing up Syria.
It's a good question. Well, the question is, how does this coalition of forces between Iran, Russia, and Turkey over Syria, how will this affect a Palestinian-Israeli settlement? Well, first, I think, let's put the Iranians at the side, because the Iranians have always opposed certain efforts we've made in peace negotiations. But they have said that if the Palestinian leadership accepts, we will accept at the end of the day. But, I'm just telling you what they're saying. What I believe or not is another question. The Russians, I think, are very interested in a Palestinian settlement with Israel. Turkey is also, although Turkey is becoming, under Erdogan, increasingly autocratic and supporting Hamas more and more. There's no question, to answer your question, that the instability in Syria and the games that Iran and Russia and Turkey are playing in Iran are just building up the instability of the region in a whole. So it doesn't help an Israeli-Palestinian peace settlement, because the situation is more volatile. But what I learned in my experience in diplomacy is that when you start having success, for example, if there were certain forward movement, you'd see these parties coming around. But I'm not going to speculate on the Iranians.
I've heard many talks. This is an excellent talk. But no one really addresses the situation in Gaza. This is a third state, two-state solution, politically and geographically. How is that incorporated in?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I skirted it in my discussion also because, right. But I did mention it in terms of the divisions of the Palestinian leadership, and I did mention Hamas and Gaza. But the thing is that is one of the fundamental weaknesses of the Palestinian leadership, is this division between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority and the PLO. And unless they get their act together, which is highly problematic, because Hamas insists on using armed force against Israel, and it says that while it will go along with any agreement that the Palestinian Authority may make with Israel, it will not recognize Israel. That's sort of like half-baked. So you're right, this is a major problem, and it is very disruptive. There may be, Israel has to always calibrate how far it's going to go in terms of military force in and out of Gaza. So it's a force of great instability. Yes, sir.
You talked about how the Carnegie approach is a little bit more opinion and demographic driven. And I'd like to know, you mentioned that you can get as high as 46% of Jewish-Israeli consensus on certain forms of a two-state solution, given certain stipulations. But if you have a liberal right of return for Palestinians who have been living in Jordan, who maybe grew up in Jordan, were born in Jordan or Syria or what have you. So if there's a liberal right of return, how might you expect public opinion within Gaza and the West Bank to shift as refugees become part of that demographic? And would it be more or less conciliatory for maintaining peace efforts?
If the Palestinian refugee issue is addressed how?
In a self-selection issue, people who are more motivated to move back may have more concentrated opinions on certain issues and more concentrated political commitments. So
that's a hard question to answer because it's hard to determine what Palestinian opinion is amongst the refugee communities, not only in the region and the world. But let me say this: these key issues I mentioned, Jerusalem, territory, refugees. I mean, these are core issues. So what you have to find is you don't capitulate on principle. So the principle of the right of return, which is embodied in UN resolutions 242, 338, a just solution to the Palestinian refugee problem, to quote the Security Council resolution. You don't capitulate on a principle, but then you game plan how, in practical terms, that can be achieved. So one of the polls, I don't have time, but read the report. And one of the interesting polling is that if the Palestinian Authority, the PLO, comes forward and outlines in more detail how it plans to resettle Palestinian refugees in the new state of Palestine, that would be quite an incentive that would bring Israeli public opinion, you see, up. And these, there are plans underway. Have been on resettlement in the state of Palestine, and the other major option is reparations, resettlement in countries in the area. The third option is a symbolic return, which is very sensitive in Israel, of maybe 50,000 or 100,000 Palestinian refugees who go back into the state of Israel. So those are the options out there that would be negotiated. And again, you don't capitulate on that principle because the Palestinians, that's like the other key issues. Yes, sir.
Yes. A few weeks ago, Mr. Ambassador, there was supposedly a leak about the Trump plan that called for some kind of Palestinian federation with Jordan. Can you talk about that as possible?
Yeah, I think that's been around for many years. And first of all, the Jordanians and King Abdullah of Jordan have made it very clear that that's totally unacceptable. And even the Palestinians have basically stated that we wouldn't even consider confederation until we got our independent state, and then we would make that decision whether to confederate with Jordan. And then the third option is confederation with Israel, either with Israel and Palestine or Israel, Palestine, Jordan. So all those things are on the table, but it's a false option because the Jordanians will simply not accept that. Yes.
You mentioned that a solution imposed from the outside is not a good idea. Did any administration before try to do that, and what was the outcome?
Failure. You can't. I'm an advocate for imposition. We, as the United States, with the international, should impose a peace process, get negotiations going. That I think we should impose, but not a solution. You can't ram it down the throats of the Israelis or the Palestinians. It has to be there. When I was ambassador to Israel, I remember my private talks with Yitzhak Rabin, the prime minister at the time. Even though the United States is the key ally of Israel, he was uneasy with us speaking on behalf of Israel to certain Arab parties. And he expressed that to me several times over a drink. That he was simply not comfortable with our guys, including me, speaking on behalf directly because these are issues of life and death. And you don't want an intermediary when you're dealing with issues of life and death. What we can do is facilitate, get them together. And so that's what I'm talking about. Impose a process, impose negotiations, absolutely. But impose a solution, no. Yes, sir.
You talked about the polling of Jews in Israel and what their feelings are.
Right.
How about non-Jews in Israel?
I did mention that. We have information on that. Of course, the Israeli Arabs, they would support a two-state solution. They're very much for a two-state solution. Very high ratings for that. But yeah, I don't have the figures all in my head, but the Israeli Arabs are much more favorable for a two-state solution than anything else, right? Yes, sir.
So an important factor in any negotiation is how people perceive the passage of time.
Mm-hmm.
So it's harder to get somebody to cut a deal if they think they're going to be in a better position next year than they are this year.
Right.
So how do you think the parties in this negotiation perceive their
That's a good
relative
question.
as time passes?
I don't think either party, I may be wrong in this, but certainly the Palestinians don't think that the passage of time, their position is going to get stronger. Although, when I talked about the one-state solution, those of you who have looked into this, Edward Said, early on was an advocate. He's a staunch Palestinian nationalist, and he advocated a one-state solution for the very reason I told you, the demographic rate of growth of the Palestinians. It's like subversively undercutting the Jewish nature of Israel. But that aside, I think the Palestinians have a very bleak future. Tomorrow doesn't look much better for the Palestinians. For the Israelis, there are two things going on in Israel. One, the Israelis within the border. You fly into Tel Aviv, you go to Israel, you think you're not in the Middle East. The food is very Middle Eastern, but you really don't think you're in the Middle East. I mean, the economy is booming, high tech. It's like a bubble. It's like a bubble. But yet, if you're an Israeli working in the national security forces of the foreign, and the government, and you're constantly conscious of the danger on the borders. So the Israelis, the simplest option for the Israelis now is continuation of this dangerous status quo, because they don't have to make hard decisions. And Bibi Netanyahu is not ready to make hard decisions now, because he'll lose his narrow. He's got someone like Naftali Bennett on the right that is yapping at his heels if he makes any sign of compromise with the Palestinians. So the answer to your question is that I think neither the Israelis nor the Palestinians see tomorrow as giving them a better chance at achieving their ends. But you revert, like in many things in life, if your options are bad, you just continue the status quo. But it's a dangerous status quo. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, please, I'm sorry.
No, I was just wondering, what's your personal opinion about when did the U.S. lose its honest broker status?
Well, it depends who you talk to. But I think, yes. Well, first of all, when we were in government during the Madrid peace negotiations, we really had the position of an honest broker. We were tough on the Israelis, and we were tough on the Arabs. Equally tough on both sides. And it worked. The Israelis didn't like it. Palestinians didn't like it. The Syrians didn't like it. I was at one meeting with Secretary Baker and Hafez al-Assad at the table in Damascus. I was ambassador there at the time in Syria. And Assad came forward with we negotiated for hours and hours in 2 days. And then in one next meeting, he took everything off the table. So Baker looked at him straight in the eye. He turned to me, said, "Was the translation correct?" I said, "Unfortunately, it's correct, Mr. Secretary." And he looked at Hafez al-Assad, and he had his leather, his briefing points in this leather cover. And he looked at Assad, and he slammed it shut, and he said, "Mr. President, we cannot do business together." And Assad retreated. He came back. We did the same thing with Shamir. He didn't clap his thing, but Shamir was more genial. But we were tough on both sides. But then you have to take the flak from both sides. But that's leadership. That's leadership. But then we began to, after Madrid, I think, Jimmy Carter, in the 70s, he played a very vital role. And, but then we began to lose our honest broker status in the years after Madrid. And today, the Israelis can be very happy with President Trump's decisions on Jerusalem and on refugees and all that, but it's pretty one-sided. And so, yes, the Israelis are happy, but is that going to bring us closer to peace?
But Rumsfeld was defense secretary. Sorry, just talking about it. In the press conferences, he always used to refer to the so-called occupied territory.
Who, Rumsfeld?
Yes.
Rumsfeld.
In public, many times.
Yes,
How is that an honest broker?
You're not an honest broker. They are occupied territories. Let's face it. They are occupied territories under international law. The Israelis don't like to hear that, but they are occupied territories. Come on.
Your ideas were echoed in a column that Tom Friedman wrote this week, where he talked about Land for Peace, and he talks about the West Bank, and that the Palestinians should be given a clear, unobstructed, uninterfered territory. And I'm curious to know, and I've heard that part of the West Bank, on the northern part, they don't have as much access, but in that context, and in your description, what kind of unfettered land would the Palestinians gain from this? Would they have everything that except
But
there
it is. I think I had this in this slide here. If I can get this to work. Okay, those are the Israeli settlements. As I said, the Male Adumim, these would be consolidated, not exactly like this, but when the 1967 borders are redrawn, these areas could be incorporated into the state of Israel. You'd have territorial one-on-one exchanges from Israel on the north, in this area, and in the south. And so basically, this probably would not exist. I think they're going to have to dismantle or do something with Ariel. It's simply too much into the Palestinian territory. But those are the compromises. And then, as our Palestinian expert said, 80% of the settlers could remain in the settlement blocks. But that sounds good, but 20%? That's a lot of people. Still, it's not as bad as it seems, but that's still a lot of people. Ariel Sharon, the architect of the settlements policies. The French have a saying, la position fait l'homme, that the position makes the man or woman, whoever's holding the position. You're defined by your position. Ariel Sharon, as a leader of the opposition, right-wing, the architect of the settlements policy, when he became prime minister, his views changed, because all of a sudden he was no longer in the opposition, but he was the prime minister of Israel, responsible for the state of Israel and the Jewish people. And he decided that the prospects for negotiations with Arafat were nil. He was going to take unilateral action. He withdrew from Gaza. That was the good news. They dismantled 18,000 settlers without any harm. But the problem with his approach was unilateral. It wasn't a bilaterally negotiated withdrawal. So the Palestinians had no obligations on their side. The Israelis left, and so Hamas took control of Gaza, and the rockets came and all that. So unilateral actions are not going to work. He also withdrew symbolically certain parts of the West Bank, Jenin. But the point I'm making here is that when you become prime minister, you see the big picture. And so what you're saying, to answer your question, that there are solutions that have been under consideration and will probably be picked up if ever there are negotiations again.
So they would have basically unobstructed control over everything else except what's in blue there?
Yeah, but here you see the Palestinian areas. You see how they're scattered here, and here are the major blocks, the settlement blocks here. This is what it probably would look like. Probably. To answer your question. That's the best we could come up with, but this again has Israeli input and Palestinian input into it. This is not just one side. Yes, sir.
Ambassador, well, philosophically, I understand the time is not going to be generous to us. On a practical matter, wouldn't this be more available and probably more likely to be done if post-Trump and maybe Netanyahu would follow his predecessor and you had different faces there? Wouldn't practically speaking, that would be a better way?
I think that's what's going to happen. I think we're going to need new political leadership, and perhaps even on certain aspects of the Palestinian side. But I think if anything's going to move forward, I think there may be a different political leadership on all sides.
Can I make one more comment?
Yes.
I know you were instrumental in settling the Lebanese situation in the 80s. I don't know if you're going to be called upon again to do it in these current years.
No one in this administration has called me. And I'm not waiting for the call. The problem with this administration is that they're not listening enough to people. Not that the past has been brilliant, but they're not reaching out and listening seriously to enough input. I'm going to have to end now. Thank you very much for coming. Appreciate it.